Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. This is the Wednesday, April 10th, 2019 edition of our little weather get-together, show number 273. And tonight we have with us Mr. Rob Galbraith. He is the most interesting man in insurance. That's what he's been dubbed the title. Rob is an author and obviously works in the insurance spectrum of the world. So tonight we're going to be talking about Are You Covered? We're going to be discussing several different weather events and natural disasters that all affect everyone in the country, but especially here in the Southeast. So Rob will be joining us tonight. He's going to give us his input and what you should do to get prepared, especially as we enter the severe weather season and the hurricane season. So we're happy to have Rob with us tonight. Before we do that, this is a live broadcast, and this is a topic you'll probably want to send your questions and comments. I know a lot of folks have different insurance policies and coverages, and maybe we can get some answers for you tonight. So if you want to do that, you are watching this probably right now on Facebook Live or Periscope. There's a little comment section there. You can type in your comment, and we will watch for those throughout the show. And if you have any questions, and when the time permits, we will ask them. And if you are listening on our podcast version, at the end of the show, we'll let Rob give off some of his social media information. And if you want to tweet him a question, I'm sure he'd be able to answer it and take it for you. So you can get the information from Rob via his Twitter account. So we welcome you again to the show 273. We're running a little bit late, so we are going to punt our news segment to the end part of the show. So stick around for the news segment. It's been a very active storm week for the Carolinas, and we're going to discuss that along with a few other things towards the end of the program. So before we do that, let's bring in our guest, Mr. Rob. Rob, welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, guys. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we're excited to have you, Rob. So one of our standard questions for our first-time guests is, how did you get caught up in this crazy weather world? I know you're in the insurance sector, but you do a lot in the weather community as well. So how did you get interested in insurance and weather?
Yes, it's a great question, Scotty. So, it's interesting. I spent 20 years working in the insurance sector, almost by accident. I'm actually in Lansing, Michigan. I just started a new job this week at a company called AF Group. And it's a little bit of a homecoming for me. I was born and raised in Michigan, went here just down the street to Michigan State. I was actually hoping to celebrate a Michigan State championship on my first day of work on Monday. Sadly, it was not to be. I was told that we were burning couches and stuff like that when Michigan State beat Duke last weekend. And so that is, brought a tear to my eye because that was happening 20 years ago when we beat Duke like the only other time. It feels like Izzo does not have a good record against Coach K or Roy Williams. So I hate Duke and I hate UNC because those are the two teams we'll beat Kentucky, we'll beat others, but yeah, I can't get past Duke or Carolina. So, I had the opportunity to move to San Antonio, actually kind of chasing a girl. And a friend of mine, when I moved down there, said, hey, whatever you can do, get on with USA. They're a large insurance company that serves military members and their families based in San Antonio. And so I did that and kind of fell into insurance. I was an econ major, so I like banking, I like investments, and I had some previous work experience doing that. And I was in the insurance space for about 5 years. I was trying to move over to different parts of the company until I realized I really like this insurance thing. This is actually way cooler than I would have ever thought. And so I bounced around to a lot of different jobs, but in the last 5 or 6 years, my job was to underwrite our homeowners and renters and rental property products. And it was against catastrophes, right? So I tell people, hey, a home in the middle of Iowa cornfield that maybe doesn't have a lot of risk, like everybody wants to write that homeowner's policy all day long. But if it comes to a hurricane-prone area or a hail-prone area or a wildfire-prone area or even earthquake or lava flow in Hawaii, like those are risks that a lot of companies don't necessarily want to write because obviously you can lose a lot of money as an insurance company. And USA is owned by their members. They're not traded publicly as a stock company. And, as an underwriter, it's like I wanted to say yes to everybody, and kind of make sure that they had protection against disasters. So I just tried to really learn about all the different exposures. And so that kind of led me to engage with the folks like the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety that has their research lab in Chester County, South Carolina. And they'll tell you, like, when you guys see damage after these major weather events, everyone talks about kind of luck, and we see those images from Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Michael and others where one home is just devastated and another home just barely has a shingle missing, right? And we all talk about luck and randomness, and it really isn't. I mean, yes, there's some element of that, of course, because we're talking about weather, but there's also engineering principles, and there's reasons behind why one home is totally destroyed and another home is left standing, and it has a lot to do with building codes and certain building techniques and whatnot. So I just love geeking out on the space. I talked to as many meteorologists as I could, as many structural engineers as I could, and so yeah, I kind of got into it that way, and just kept the network going, kept meeting a bunch of cool people, and following folks on Twitter, just so I could I had to cover the whole country, so like Twitter is just my connection with what's going on all over all 50 states, and yeah, it just became a passion.
I know I follow you on Twitter, and you're a great follow. And I actually was able to hear you speak at the National Tornado Summit. So you do obviously have a really interesting job. So tell us about this. I mean, you are out, like you said. We'll talk about the health study in just a little bit, but you get to go out to these facilities and see how homes are becoming more resistant to weather and things like that. So tell us a little bit about that and some of the coolest things you've been able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things I like to do is work with our claims team right after an event and kind of just see the damage, see them helping. I mean, that's the whole point of insurance, right? Is to be there at your greatest time of need. And what those guys do is just magic, it's a lot of work. It's grueling hours. Oftentimes in these disaster areas, it's not like they just go have a nice steak dinner when they're done for the day or whatnot. I mean, you're talking about Cliff Bars, and they bring a big old jug of water, and it can be pretty rough, in some of these areas. But they want to get to it obviously as quickly as possible and get money in people's hands and help them on the road to recovery. And so those are the ones also that kind of got me saying, hey, look at this house. The reason that, they're in good shape is because of X, Y, and Z, and look at this other house. And there's other stuff that you wouldn't necessarily know or think about, but it makes intuitive sense. Like, I'll give you an example. So following Hurricane Irma, I went to go view this community that was kind of in the Orlando area, where it was about a Cat 1. So it wasn't in Naples, it wasn't a Cat 4, right? A little bit farther inland, but still the eye wall had passed right over this area. And there were homes that were right on the golf course, had a beautiful view of the fairway, and they were just decimated because the wind came off the pond and came off the golf course. There was nothing to break that wind. Whereas just down the street a little bit, if you didn't necessarily have the view of the fairway, but you had houses on all sides, you barely had any damage at all, right? Because you kind of had some natural protection. And the other thing that I think is kind of interesting are like trees. Trees can be your friend, or they can be your worst nightmare. So I saw a home that was not in great shape. The roof was just terrible and all that, but it was in a more rural part of the state, and it was surrounded by some pretty big trees, and those trees totally broke the wind and kind of preserved this older, not in great shape house. Whereas on the flip side, I've seen other houses that were really, really well built, but of course the tree, falls right in the middle of the roof and kind of totally damages it. So there's definitely an element of luck. But there's a lot of science behind it as well.
Go ahead, Henry.
Oh, gotcha. When it comes to severe weather and, trying to insure for different types of things like lightning, hail, tornadoes, is there anything that is covered differently, or as an insurance agent, you're kind of looking at differently when you're trying to figure out the risk and perhaps what people end up paying?
Yeah, so there's a lot of big differences, to be honest. Some stuff is pretty standard, but I always tell people, so when people buy insurance, they usually buy insurance because it allows them to do something they really want to do, right? It's like a checkbox. So, you want to drive that new car off the dealer's lot, so you got to get insurance before you can do that, right? Or you want to close on your mortgage, so you've got to have insurance before you do it. So most people don't spend a lot of time in that moment really talking with their agent, trying to understand this policy. It's like, just give me a quote, right? And the agent's asking you a bunch of questions. You're like, just give me to the bottom line, right? Like, what's this going to cost me? And then after it, like, great, congratulations, you have a house, or, you rented an apartment, and you don't really think about it, right? Because that task was done and you moved on with your life. And so what I tell people is that, it's not just about price. Each company has different policies. They cover things differently. And then some parts may be covered, but other parts are not covered. And so there's a lot that kind of goes into it. If you really want to know, you should read your own policy. You shouldn't necessarily trust what your agent said. Your agents would love it, by the way, if you actually did, just because you would have a lot more intelligent questions to ask them. But obviously, it's a language for somebody like me that's worked in 20 years. I can spot, what's maybe a good policy and what's a not so good policy from a coverage standpoint. But most of us don't have that kind of experience. So that's where you really need to rely on your agent as somebody that you trust. It's not just somebody that's selling. Like, agents are licensed. This isn't just going to Best Buy and selling you the latest iPhone. Like, they have to go to training and they have to have continuous education to keep current on stuff. So you should think of them not just as a salesperson, but truly your advisor. And so ask them just to walk you through, what am I covered for, and have them take the time to walk through it. And if you have a question or you don't understand, or you're like, well, is this covered or is that, or what about this scenario? Definitely take the time to ask them some of those questions.
Would having any storm-resistant items, let's say a more secured roof, like hurricane straps or something like that, a tornado-safe room, would any of those be factored into a policy?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and the answer is yes. What I would say, though, is that some companies will offer an explicit discount for those things, right? So you're like, well, what am I getting for my hurricane straps, or my openings protection on my garage door, or my storm shutters for my windows? And some companies offer it as a discount. So they'll say, well, you're saving, $300 because you have that. Other companies kind of just bake it into the premium calculation. They don't necessarily break it out as a specific discount. And so people get frustrated because the agent will be like, well, you're not necessarily, like, I can't give you a number for what you're getting credit for, but you kind of need to trust that behind the scenes, all the actuarial math and whatnot, it's being in there. So I always tell people, just focus on the bottom line total premium. Like, you may be getting a $300 discount for having that storm shutters on your windows, but if you're paying $1,500 and somebody else is paying $1,200, well, $1,200 is lower than $1,500, and so you may not see it. Maybe you're getting $600 credit over here. It just isn't broken out, separate as a line item. So yes, those are all the factors that kind of go into calculating what your premium is. And obviously, the better construction you have, the better. Different companies are going to offer different amounts of credit for those things too. So that's definitely something to shop around. I think other people are sometimes people are set it or forget it, or maybe they're just intimidated and they don't always shop their insurance. And that's something I encourage people to do. Even if ultimately you end up in the same place, it's always good just to kind of make sure that your price is competitive, and most important from my perspective, that you have really good coverage.
Let's talk about the IBHS hail study here for a second. What was that study? Why was it done? And what was some of the biggest things that were learned out of it?
Yeah, so the IBHS team is just a tremendous asset to the industry. Very quickly, kind of the insurance industry, many of the companies are members of the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, or IBHS. And so they pool all their money together to do some pretty basic scientific research, similar to the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, that does all the crash testing and all that we often kind of see on videos, and tells you what car is a good car, and 5-star rating, 4-star, 3-star. It's really the same idea with these guys, but from a property standpoint. And so the hail study in particular, there's two different types of tests for a hail-resistant roof. One of them uses steel balls, which you might imagine, like it never ever rains steel balls. So that's not a really accurate way to gauge the effectiveness of an impact-resistant roof. The other test for it actually makes ice like ice cubes in your fridge. And ice cubes in your fridge are actually very different than true hail. So true hail often kind of has those rings, almost like tree rings, or it can be very dense, and sometimes it's clear and sometimes it's cloudy, right? And it's formed in the atmosphere, just in an entirely different process than ice that you make in the tray, where oftentimes the ice actually has a lot of cracks and fractures, and if that were to hit your roof, it would be very slushy ice. Hail can be obviously very slushy hitting your roof, but it can be really dense as well and just kind of pound like a hammer. And so, there's lots of questions. We focus all the time, of course, on the diameter of the hail, right? But some of the research they want to know is maybe if you had some pretty good sized diameter hail, but just periodic or, a little bit here and there, how does that compare with just a deluge of pea-sized hail? Like, we think the pea-sized hail is no big deal, but we don't really know. Maybe if there's a ton of it, it's just as damaging as the big stuff that's more, sporadic that's out there. So really the only way for them to be able to make like realistic hail in the lab facility in Chester County was to go out and chase hailstorms in the field and collect observations. And one of the tough things, there's not been a lot of academic research done on hail. And quite frankly, like, hail melts, right? So in terms of getting a good data set, observational data set for the weather, we just don't have a lot of good information. There's hail spotter reports and stuff like that. I think it's improved tremendously in the social media world, where people can now take photos. They can actually, hold up their ruler with it, right? But we just, in the past, didn't have a good data set for hail. So they have gone out for several years now to actually collect all this realistic hail in the field. They have over 5,000 hailstones in their database. So it's the world's largest database of hail observations. And they offer member companies the opportunity to kind of embed within them as they deploy. And so that was really the opportunity that I got. And I can tell you, as an insurance underwriter, the idea of driving into the dark clouds and I can tell you it was kind of safe storm chasing. So really the purpose is to deploy some probes ahead of the storm and then get out of Dodge and let the storm pass over the probes and then come back in. So we didn't have like the roll cage and all that kind of stuff. We've got obviously kind of online radar that we're constantly monitoring and try to be, very, very intelligent about where we are to be safe at all times.
So I'm going to transition away from the severe weather and just kind of come up with this one stat that we are 52 days away from hurricane season. So could you talk to the people who are watching tonight about some of the things that they may want to do going into hurricane season for an insurance check?
Yeah, no, thanks, Melissa. Great question. So the first thing, and obviously, we saw it with Hurricane Florence. I experienced it. I live in San Antonio, Texas, with Hurricane Harvey the year before, is flooding. Matthew obviously was a huge flood event as well. Something both with Matthew and then 2 years later with Florence, there was some talk even about like dodging the bullet. It's, not as severe as we originally thought it was going to be, but everyone was focused obviously on Saffir-Simpson. And it was, oftentimes the effects were much more devastating inland than on the coast. And what, people learn about in those type of events, but they don't necessarily remember or know if they've recently moved to the Carolina area or another hurricane-prone region from, say, the west or from a state like Michigan, where I'm located right now, is that flood insurance is not covered by your standard homeowner's policy. You have to buy it through the federal government. They don't necessarily do a ton of marketing on TV, right, the way a lot of insurance companies do and stuff like that. So it's something that your agent can sell you oftentimes, but you have to ask for it. And I think, a couple myths. So number one, your typical homeowner's policy does not cover flood or renters, and you can buy flood insurance on a renter's policy as well. The second thing is, unfortunately, a lot of people will tell you don't need flood insurance. And what they mean is actually a very narrow technical definition. So certain mortgages that are within a 100-year floodplain as defined by FEMA you're required to have flood insurance in order to get a mortgage in those areas. But if you live outside what's considered a 1 in 100 year floodplain, you're not required to buy flood insurance. Actually, 25% of flood losses happen outside of that floodplain. So you still have a 1 in 4 chance, pretty high. And so I always tell people, like, you wouldn't go to a casino with those odds, right? And potentially risk the largest investment that you have, your home. And so, it's not worth the risk. You need to buy a policy. You need the coverage. If you live in a floodplain, there's a reason that it's going to be expensive, because your risk is very high. If you live outside the floodplain, the good news is you're going to be paying the lowest possible rate that's offered for flood insurance in those areas. The other thing that I will mention about flood insurance is that there's a 30-day waiting period. So when people are talking about hurricane season, it's right around the corner, and we kind of focus on that June 1st date. Well, now's the time to be calling around, asking your agent, can you give me a quote on flood insurance? Let me know, how much it's going to be, reviewing your coverages, because 30 days from now, right, it's going to be kind of the middle of May. We're going to be right against hurricane season. So it's not something that, once you see you're in the cone of uncertainty, that you can just call your agent and get coverage for the next day. And that's true definitely of flood insurance, but it's also often true for regular homeowners or renter insurance as well. Companies often issue what are known as coverage suspensions or moratoriums. And so this was actually something that my team did while I was at USA, where we would actively monitor weather phenomenon, and we would actually get updates an hour ahead of the National Hurricane Center's updates, working with a private company that kind of knew where the homes were, because we didn't want that National Hurricane Center update to kind of come out and then all of a sudden everyone's scrambling for the door. So, often by the time that people hear the latest update and then call to either make an adjustment in their policy or try to get a new policy, companies have already said, nope, I know you're in the cone of uncertainty. You're not going to fool me. We're not issuing new policies right now.
A question on that realm, in today's world of social media and people having access to all these computer models and everything, and the Euro model being posted online, has that changed anything in how people either react and maybe call up their insurance companies more or things like that?
I wish. So it definitely changes how people react, but unfortunately they don't think about insurance first. I'll give you a good example, and I saw this probably the most in Irma, because it was following Harvey. So obviously following Harvey, it was such a long, lingering storm, and even 2 to 3 weeks after the storm, we had the gas shortage, right? So even me in San Antonio, I wasn't affected by Harvey personally. I actually put a rain gauge out, and I was thinking that we might get some rain. It wasn't even measurable, really. It was like an inch of rain. So it was just terrible to see all the images from, Corpus Christi and Rockport, obviously, when it came ashore, and then as well as, of course, Houston and Beaumont and stuff. And here we are, like, it barely was enough to keep the lawn green in San Antonio. A lot of times, people in Irma, right, because of that impact of the gas shortage and all that, like, people were much more quicker to evacuate in Florida. And also, I think it was the path of Irma, right, just going totally straight up the peninsula, being so wide to cover kind of the entire peninsula of Florida. So people were evacuating right away, and then oftentimes insurance coverages will pay for your hotel and may pay for some per diem, some meals or whatnot if you are forced to evacuate. But that evacuation has to be declared by a civil authority. So a voluntary evacuation, like you decide, because I'm monitoring it, that, hey, we just need to get out of Dodge and go to Atlanta or someplace like that. And then you call and say, hey, are you going to cover my, my stay at the Westin or the Marriott for 5 nights? It's like, no, that's not going to happen. And that was actually something, I do see a lot of misinformation about insurance on social media as well. So people will say, well, this is covered, or you should call this, or don't worry about that, or ask for this. And again, I always tell people, like, talk to your agent. Don't believe what I'm not necessarily saying what you're reading on social media is always incorrect. It could be factual, but oftentimes I can tell you from the companies that I've worked for, I know that that's not always accurate, and I can imagine that it's other information I'm seeing about other carriers is also not accurate. So again, insurance tends to be a very low touch product. We buy it, might renew once a year, maybe you get that birthday card from your agent or whatever, but it's really something that you want to have an ongoing conversation. They don't have to be your BFF, right? But you do want to be kind of regularly touching base with your agent, and not believing what you're hearing online, or not having that be the moment when it's like, do I evacuate or not, to be the time when you start thinking about, do I have the right coverage, and where do I go to for advice?
And Rob, one other thing before we kind of leave the hurricane subject. You said you lived there in San Antonio during Harvey. I'm sure you've heard and was with Matthew's destruction here in the Carolinas. A lot of stories we heard, especially here in the North Carolina area, they were towns that even now are inhabitable, and a lot of these folks didn't have flood insurance. So, I don't think flood insurance should have selling points, but basically, if you don't have flood insurance and your home's flooded out, there's nothing that your insurance people can do.
No, it's true of your car, which often is covered, but right, it's a total, like, your car's gonna be a mess, whatever. And you also have to be very mindful buying a used car after a flood event. Ironically, like in flood events, they tend to move the flooded vehicles to a whole different part of the country. So I know in Texas, like, we were seeing all of a sudden a bunch of Harvey flooded vehicles for sale in Ohio and stuff like that. And there's something called a salvage title. People think you're getting a good deal. Like, you should be very suspicious after a hurricane event if you're buying a used vehicle. And ironically, like, the best place to buy it was probably in Houston, right? Because they try to ship them to other parts of the country and stuff. But you're right. And so the other thing too, I will say about flood insurance, so people always go by, well, it's only ever got up to here, right? I think we kind of saw some of those signs in Florence, right? And from previous events that have come on, Floyd and Hugo and stuff like that, and they have different kind of, like, almost like your kids growing up, like high water marks and stuff like that. So that shouldn't always be your barometer in terms of, like, well, it's only ever got up to here, so I'm not, at risk. And then the amount of flood. So people think about, obviously storm surge, right, and like pushing the house and just this like massive wall of water. They say the federal government says there's kind of a rule of thumb, like for every inch of water that's in your home, that's about $10,000 worth of damage. So if you think about it, just a little bit of water above, your carpet, your hardwood floors, all that, just think about how much it would cost to replace all that. And then it gets really bad if they make it up to your electrical outlets, right? Because that could just totally mess up. We have to rip out all the drywall, redo all the electricity and whatnot. So I think people have this idea of, like, you climb into the roof, right? And like kind of, tearing a hole in the roof, like during a Katrina type of event, right? We saw some of that stuff, and it doesn't have to be like that. It can just be a little bit of water in your house, but drying all that out and all that is just a mess. And then, your house is kind of always a flooded house. It'll always affect the real estate value of your home. If you are fortunate enough to even be able to pay to repair the damage, right, people are still going to know, well, you got flooded out in this event, and they're going to be kind of suspicious about any repairs. And they may even ask you, like, did you have flood coverage? Was this covered by an insurance claim versus you having to pay out of pocket? Because I think if you paid out of pocket, they're going to assume that you cut corners, or maybe you're not being fully transparent. And again, like those claims quickly become in the tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and most folks just don't have that kind of cash lying around.
Another thing that just come to mind, and Ricky lived near Virginia Beach, and Melissa deals with flooding a lot, Jared as well in Charleston. Your area necessarily doesn't have to be hit by the hurricane. We've seen in the past 3 or 4 years that we've had river flooding, where maybe it flooded a lot in eastern North Carolina, and there's rivers that flowed into the Atlantic. We saw places in like Myrtle Beach, Horry County, Socastee, places that really wasn't affected by a lot of rain from the hurricane, but they actually saw more flooding 5 days, 10 days after the storm passed because the river flooding.
Absolutely, yeah. So we got the same thing going on in Texas, where we've gotten hit by many floods. I think there's been like 5 1 in 100-year floods in the Houston area in the last 10 years, something like that. I mean, it's just insane, like how much flood. In fact, In San Antonio, the first year I lived there, 1998, we were hit with a devastating flood. And then again, it hadn't been like biblical proportions, 200 years, whatever. And then 4 years later, 2002, we got hit by the same type of event. And so the city actually invested in a lot of infrastructure to move floodwaters out of the way. And so since then, we haven't been hit with a huge flood. The story I've been told is that Houston hasn't invested in the same, they actually recently passed a huge bond in the city to have those types of projects. And again, like your risk can change over time too, right? So I know Houston, like urban sprawl, paving over areas that typically would have been either absorbent to the water or ways to kind of funnel or channel water out. People don't necessarily realize that the risk changes over time, particularly as an area becomes more and more developed and more paved over. The water pathways, right, kind of change in terms of where the water needs to go in a mega flood event. So yeah, I think the risk is much more widespread that happens than a lot of people realize. And the other thing I'll say about just in general, this is the type of thing that you see people that are devastated and you feel bad for them, but nobody thinks that's going to happen to them. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, right? Like, and as an insurance company, you're like, well, what about testimonials? What about, we'll show these people online? And it's like, they'll feel bad for that person, but they just are like, that happened to them. That's not going to happen to me. And if you think about it, like it's a healthy, like psychological thing that we have as humans, right? Like we don't want to think about the worst happening to us all the time, right? That would just be us in a paralyzing state of fear if you were just constantly, we get on airplanes and my wife has always got like the hand wipes out. She's wiping down the seat belt and that she reads all the studies about how many germs on airlines, right? And I'm like, I'm sure you're totally right, but I don't want to think about all that stuff, right? I don't want to think about Ebola or whatever, and that's just human nature. But those should be warning signs. And then those stories of events like Florence, like Matthew that we've heard, obviously it could happen again, and it could happen to you if you dodge the bullet twice. Ironically, sometimes a near miss is actually, you think like, oh, I'm invincible. You know what I mean? You hear that about near-death experiences and stuff like that as well.
And Rob, one thing here in Western North Carolina that we face, not only with tropical systems that bring heavy rain, we also see the potential for landslides and sinkholes and things like that. So is that covered in insurance? But how, if folks are worried about that, what questions should they ask from their insurance agencies?
Yeah, so I would ask exactly that question, Scotty. Yeah, I mean, I will tell you that each company is a little bit different, and each state, quite frankly, is a little bit different. We probably see it the most in Florida or in Tennessee, ironically, has quite a bit of sinkholes, but definitely the Carolinas are subject as well. And typically, earth movement is not covered of any type. So it could be a landslide, right? It could be an earthquake is typically not covered on its own, just anything like that. And the other thing too, you talked about Western Carolina. So obviously you can have a wildfire like we saw in Gatlinburg with the Chimney Tops 2 fire. And this happens all the time in California, where you have a fire that has kind of wiped out some vegetation. And then you have a heavy rainstorm after the fact, right? And that vegetation would kind of break the water or the erosion. And if that gets wiped out, then you can easily have a mudslide type of event. And so those are definitely things that you want to ask about, is that covered? Is it not covered? How much would it get to be covered? That's something in your policy. So there's a part that's called exclusion. So I'm not saying you got to read the whole thing, but you should absolutely read the exclusion section of your policy. If you don't know where it is, ask your agent, show me where my exclusions are, and read through that very carefully. And if there's something on there like landslides that you are concerned in your area, you're going to know, you're trained better than I will. Then you should ask, well, can I buy coverage for this? And so sometimes you might have to buy coverage from a different company for that as well. So that's something that, like, don't feel like, okay, well, this is my company, I like my company, I'm stuck with them, they don't cover this. You can say, well, I want to keep my homeowner's policy, but I want to buy extra coverage for sinkhole or extra coverage for landslides or what have you. Can you help me with that? The other thing that I'll mention is in both North Carolina and South Carolina, there's something known as a state wind pool. So people on the coast they may not actually, they may have what's known as an ex-wind or excluded wind policy from their homeowner or carrier, and you have to buy it through the state organization to get coverage for just the wind part of your policy. And so I tell people that live in hurricane-prone areas that you might have to buy up to 3 policies, kind of your standard homeowner's policy, a wind-only policy to cover the hurricane risk, and then also a flood policy. So it can get very, very confusing. And again, that's where a really reliable agent is important. And so, I would also say shop your agent, kind of ask 2 or 3 people. I know some people, it's like, oh, you just saw their sign or they advertise at your kid's little league or whatever. But this is somebody that, you want to be able to trust in your greatest time of need, and you want to make sure that they're giving you good financial advice. So just like you would shop for, right, we're, right close to tax season, right, and you want to go to H&R Block or Jackson Hewitt or Liberty Tax, and you want to figure out who the right or accountant, right, it'd be no different than that, or an investment advisor. It's somebody that you're talking about, financial security for you and your family. It's got to be somebody you trust.
Rob, we were talking about the wildfires, and I want to use that as a perfect segue. You were talking about West North Carolina, and in 2016 we had all those fires. I know that was a scary time for many people across West North Carolina. My family and almost everyone in Asheville included, we had a fire just 10, 15 miles away with ash falling out of the sky, and that's something you don't see every day, especially in North Carolina, but that can happen anywhere from South Florida to North Alaska. So how do insurance policies cover forest fires, and what do people need to be looking for?
Yeah, so that's another one where actually I've talked to wildfire experts, and they say the return interval in an area, just kind of all along the Appalachians, right, in western North Carolina and elsewhere, they do get fire. So we hear about them in California all the time because the return period is like, well, it used to be every 20 years. Now it feels like it's every 5 to 10 years, right? And so, and out east, they certainly don't get to the same acreage that they do in the west. They're not like the wall of fire usually that we kind of see on TV, on CNN and stuff like that. But so the smaller acreage burns, and they happen less frequently, more in the 40 to 80 year time interval. But they absolutely do. This is part of an ecosystem. Actually, those trees need fire. I've talked to a forest ecologist, and he talks about just an epidemic of trees. And he said, we look at these mountains and we just see a sea of trees. And he goes, we assume that that's the way it's always been. But if you actually look at historical photographs, it tends to be more patchy, where you have a tree, but you've also got some meadows and some grasslands and stuff like that. And so, a grass fire, right, that occasionally engulfs a tree or two is just a very different event, where it's going crown to crown to crown to crown, right? So because these areas have been preserved and people live in these areas where before maybe we didn't care about it, now we care because people live in these areas, and so we're very quick to suppress the fires, and so it just kind of builds up the tinderbox for the next time. So I think just being aware that you live in a devastating area, obviously asking your agent, am I covered for wildfire? Do I have any special exclusions, or maybe have different limits or a higher deductible or something like that? And then definitely planning with your family. It's not just about insurance. I mean, that's a major portion, but having a plan, like an evacuation, knowing where you're going to go, having a go bag ready where you just grab it. When I talk to audiences, I had this video that it's kind of funny, but it's also a little scary, of a fire that happened in Florida, actually, in the panhandle of Florida. And this guy gets on there. He's like, I just grabbed 2 bottles of booze and we got out of there. And I was like, okay, at least you took something with you. But like in the panic of the moment, you're not necessarily going to be thinking rationally about, I need this, I need this. So there's lots of great resources online. I would tell people, ready.gov is one. There's also an organization called FLASH, Federal Alliance for Safe Homes.org. They've got a ton on building codes, and they also have that. And, cell phone charges is probably the one that we always talk to people about, right? Of like, you forget how much of our lives are on our cell phone, and so you're absolutely going to need that. And so we saw that certainly in Gatlinburg and others, of people just not knowing how to get out, or the path was broken or whatnot. So just knowing, what to do in those types of events, and being aware that, that's something. And then, there are some things that you can do. So there's something called being fire-wise. So you create some defensible space around your property. You take all the leaves out of your gutter, like doing some raking and stuff. And I know it's kind of weird, like just to say, well, doing a little bit of yard work and can greatly reduce your wildfire risk, but it can, And then if you bond together as a community, you get just kind of like a 10x return on that, because sometimes your greatest risk is going to be the neighbor that lives right next to you. And so the FireWise USA program is something that you can Google online. It's run through the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, and they do a great job in terms of, how do you get the community involved to work together. And so you can have, like, I know it sounds funny, we're talking about wildfire barbecues and stuff like that, kind of a get together, right? And the longer that your FireWise, like each year, there's kind of a cumulative impact of reducing your risk. We definitely saw some success stories, but it's not foolproof. So there's also FireWise communities out in Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina that have burned down. So just because you've participated in the past, you have to obviously keep up with it, because the vegetation grows back, the leaves fall again, etc.
Okay, I thought somebody else was going to say something. Rob, last week we were talking about it was National Safe Place Selfie Day, and where the discussion was talking about being prepared for severe weather and the hurricane season coming up. So our last question for you tonight is, we've kind of talked about what insurance covers and what it doesn't, but if we were to give like a spiel for the next 5 minutes, as we start to get into hurricane season and the severe weather season, what should folks do? I know you recommend maybe policy reviews, deductions, things like that. So what would your advice be to folks who are listening tonight?
Yeah, so I would definitely say get the policy review, understand what perils is kind of the term in insurance. So, is it wind, is it fire, right? What perils are you covered against? What is your deductible? Meaning, that's the amount that would be your portion of that. So it could be $500, it could be $1,000, but it could be $5,000 or $10,000 sometimes. And so you want that to be obviously an affordable number. And sometimes it could be different for wind versus fire or lightning or something else. So having your agent kind of walk through that. And then coverage. So a lot of people think that the amount that you should be covered for is what you bought your home for, or what you would sell your home for. And it's really the replacement cost of your home. So if your home was to be totally rebuilt from the ground up today, not taking into account any economies of scale that might have come from builder that was building out a subdivision, say, also taking into account what's known as debris removal. So if your house is totally wiped out, right, your policy will actually cover holding all the sticks or whatever's left away and allowing you to rebuild. So insurance companies always have estimates or kind of calculators for what is an appropriate rebuild cost. And a lot of people don't understand that number, or they may not like that number, and they kind of pick a lower number because they're trying to save a few bucks on their premium. And trust me, it's totally not worth it. I see that time and again where somebody kind of lowballs and it's like, okay, you got a beautiful 4-bedroom house. Now you can only afford to rebuild a 2-bedroom house, right? So, where's your son or daughter going to stay? Or, then, the other part is just be weather aware. I know we talk about it all the time. But trust me, from an insurance perspective, where you see literally thousands of people each and every year that are in that claim situation, it is obviously very distressing, very devastating. And I tell people, even if you have a great insurance company and they're going to be there and they're going to be able to make good on their promise and pay out. I ask people, like, have you ever been on a vacation for 2 weeks? My experience with my family for 2 weeks. It's like by the end of the second week, we're kind of getting at each other's throats when we're staying in a hotel room like I'm tonight or whatever, right? We're all ready to get back home. So imagine a devastating loss from a hurricane or a wildfire, and now you're out of your home for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. You're having to deal with all the contractors. They're asking you all these questions. You want to know, like, the school's coming back. Are my neighbors coming back? What's going to happen with my job? I mean, there's so many things kind of going on. So I know, taking half a day on your weekend here or there just to either, harden your home, do yard work, drill with your family in terms of, where are we going to go in case of emergency? Where's our rendezvous point? Where's that selfie place, that safe place, place where you can take a selfie and stuff. We're busy. We have busy lives and increasingly busy, but it is so worth just that small investment of your time because, trust me, it happens each and every year to people. And in that moment, if it did happen to you, you're going to want to make sure that you had the proper coverage, that your evacuation route, that you had the go bag, and that you make the best of a bad situation.
It's all good information, Rob. So for our followers who may be listening on the podcast or maybe watching this later on, if they have any direct questions, maybe you could help them with, how can they get in touch with you? What's the best way?
Yeah, so as you guys mentioned, I'm pretty active on social media. So Twitter is a great medium. My Twitter handle is pretty easy. It's Rob Galb, so R-O-B, and then the first four of my last name, G-A-L-B. I'm happy to just tweet at me or send me a DM. You can also find me on Facebook. If you type in Rob Galbraith or Rob Galbraith Insurance or something like that, you can definitely Google me as Rob Galbraith Insurance as well. And then actually on Instagram, I'm literally it actually fits, but it's the most interesting man in insurance, all one word on Instagram. So happy to have you send me a message that way as well.
Rob's a great follow on social media, and you're also an author. You want to plug your book right now?
Sure, yeah. So I wrote a book. So my other passion is technology and innovation in the insurance space. So that's what the book is about. It's called The End of Insurance as We Know It. And it talks about, artificial intelligence and all these things that I think are actually going to benefit insurance to the good and actually help consumers kind of understand it and hopefully bring costs down and just make it a better product and a better experience. I also tentatively have another book that I'm going to start working on soon. And this one is actually going to be very much related to insurance, weather, and climate change, and kind of the way insurance can kind of help people maybe. So I tell people your insurance premium is a sign of your risk. Like people could tell you this is high risk or moderate risk, or it's different risk for different things, and it's hard to like keep all track of it. But we all know if it costs $6,000 to insure this house and it's only $2,000 for this house over here, well, you can bet that $6,000 house is 3 times as risky, right, as a $2,000 house, because we all kind of understand dollars as a unit of measure. And so it's tentatively titled How Insurance Can Save the World. And so definitely, more info to come. If I finish that one, hopefully you guys will have me back on and I can tell you all about it.
I think we've already got a show topic that we can discuss. So we'd love to have you back on. Stick around if you want to, Rob. We're going to do a little weather discussion. If you want to talk about the weather in your area, we'd definitely love that. But for now, I'm going to toss it to Jared Smith tonight, who's got our news headlines. Jared?
Thank you, Scotty. Nice to be with everybody tonight. Pretty busy day in weather and science and lots of other things. So piggybacking off, talking about insurance, NOAA came up with a press release today. Talking about billion-dollar disasters. So we've got 2 of those so far this year, 2 of them cataloged as billion-dollar disasters. The most recent one being the significant flooding in the Midwest in March 2019. This damaged Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. It's the 3rd military base to sustain significant weather damage in the last 18 months. So we all remember Tyndall in particular during Michael. So we're seeing some real major issues, not only from a personal property perspective, but also from a national defense perspective with weather disasters. The other billion-dollar disaster is the severe weather outbreak in the Southeast, Ohio Valley and Northeast. This happened back in February, and numerous tornadoes, lots of tornadoes and straight line wind damage, flooding along the Ohio, Tennessee River valleys there. That was assessed at $1.2 billion in losses. They still haven't put a number on the flooding yet. That's still an ongoing thing, but that is certainly going to be up there for sure. So again, billion-dollar disasters, we're seeing them increasing frequency. So something to keep an eye on. We'll update you guys as soon as we know more about the numbers behind that. Melissa caught some nice thunderstorms today as we were, I'm going to share my screen here. We were here in Charleston thinking it's going to be a quiet day. We were thinking all the weather is going to be south of us. So, of course, naturally, something else, it decides to do something else. And so we have these nice overachieving thunderstorms here, and you can see I'm going to take these pictures full. And so there's an anvil. Now this is 80, 90, 100 miles away from Charleston. And I'll switch over to that. There's Melissa's location, and there are the thunderstorms. These are near the barrier islands of South Carolina. Seeing them right there on radar scope. So pretty cool. Some high cloud tops. The radar estimated them around 45,000 feet. I took a look earlier when Melissa sent that to me and was like, yep, I was right under those. I know all about those. I miss those. Sorry, Charleston, about that. But it happens sometimes, and we know nobody's perfect. And then speaking of radar, there was a very unfortunate incident this morning in Durham, North Carolina. 1 dead, 15 injured. A contractor hit a 2-inch pipe. He was digging and he hit a pipe, a gas pipe, and it caused an explosion. And here you can see this is a radar scope GIF. Evan Fisher got this for us. I'm going to try and see if I can't take that fuller here. Let me zoom in on it a little bit more so y'all can see it. And yeah, so there it is. You see it coming right out of Durham there. There's a little poof of reflectivity there, and that is a smoke plume picked up on radar. This was nasty. This was a bad explosion. Reports of windows shattering there. We were hoping to get some seismograph information from down there, but there is no longer a seismometer in operation in that neck of the woods. But I'm sure it would have registered. It was a very nasty explosion, and we were definitely thinking about everybody who was affected by this. Very scary situation for sure. And then on a lighter note, so here is National Science Foundation using that as their pin tweet. We have the first image of a black hole, and this was put together through an array of telescopes, numerous exposures put together. And yes, this is a black hole. This is at the this is at the Event Horizon Telescope, and we got to give a shout out to Dr. Katie Bowman, because I love this. All right, so I mean, you've got it. This is so cool. You're making history here, and this is what it looks like when you're making astrophysics history. It's like, oh my goodness, I'm seeing my picture, stitched together for the first time. So, congratulations to Dr. Bowman and her team. This is really fascinating. I mean, this is a whole new world for us to see this kind of interstellar stuff. And there was supposed to be a Falcon Heavy launch tonight, speaking of space, but that got scrubbed, waiting for a reschedule on that. So a lot going on, and that was just today, Scotty. And we're going to let you guys talk about, there's a whole lot more, in the way of strong to severe thunderstorms. We had some hail. We had some hail yesterday. We had all sorts of stuff yesterday, Scotty.
Yeah, it's been a pretty active week. My dogs joined us here for the round table. So this is Lolo, the weather dog. But anyways, it has been a pretty crazy week. We've had severe weather roll through on Monday and Tuesday. In fact, on Monday, parts of North Carolina was under an enhanced risk of severe weather. I will say for my part of the area here in western North Carolina, we didn't get much in the way. I'm going to let Lolo go. But we didn't get much in the way of severe weather. But we did see some hail reports and some damaging wind reports from the Raleigh area and towards East North Carolina. And then Tuesday, we had another round of severe weather. And I think personally, it was probably a little bit more worse than it was on Monday. But again, nothing too major for us in Western North Carolina. I know Chris is not with us tonight, but Chris was out chasing. Melissa, how was things there in the Midlands of South Carolina?
We definitely had some pretty strong winds come through with that one line. I believe we had, there was a RC wind station over on Lake Murray Dam that reported a 44 mile an hour wind gust. And then the Columbia Owens downtown airport actually had a wind gust of 49 miles an hour as those storms rolled through. And they came right around rush hour too, which is the worst possible time to have severe weather roll through an area. Other than that, we did get some pretty good rainfall. I think the biggest thing, and I know that there's some pictures out there of these just big, huge yellow clouds just moving ahead of the rainfall. So, but we fared pretty well okay here in the Midlands. I did not have to use my safe place this time, unlike earlier in March when I definitely had to.
Evan reminded me here in the group chat, Evan, I'll bring you in. Not all of Western North Carolina escaped without the severe weather. There was some pretty impressive video coming out of the Brevard area of some hail. And Evan, it held so much, it actually looked like it snowed there.
Yeah, so Tuesday with that second round of storms, Brevard really got pounded with some, not necessarily the high winds, but they had ping pong ball size hail. And it was just coming down. Like you said, it really was accumulating in the streets. And even in the grassy surfaces. So it was a rarity for Western North Carolina. We don't typically see weather like that.
And Jared, on the coastline, you guys fared out fairly well too. I know y'all had some strong storms, but nothing too major down there.
We've got this little like just capping inversion that just decides to set up. It basically is like the Jared doesn't get to see anything cool. Capping inversion is what it's called. And that's generally what happens. The marine layer, again, it has its ways with our weather. And, Monday was questionable. We got some, we were pretty warm most of the day, but everything fizzled out real fast as it got into Charleston, and we really didn't get much rain out of that. We did get a pretty nice rainstorm yesterday. Out of, there were some strong storms. We started the day in a slight risk, got downgraded or upgraded to a marginal, depending on how you look at it. But we did have a small risk of severe weather. But again, most of that stayed to the south. The better forcing was there. We had the marine layer advecting onshore. And so we got a nice steady rain. It was like really good sleeping weather. Occasional rumble of thunder, nothing too crazy. And then today we were supposed to have a pretty nice day. And then as we talked about earlier, I got another half-inch or so of rain at the house. So I've got quite the 3-day report to send to Melissa in Kokoraz. So it's been good. The good thing is that we're in moderate drought here along the coast. And while this isn't busting that drought per se, it's kind of blunting it a little bit. We're still running about 6 inches behind for the year at the airport observation site. So we'll see what the drought monitor says tomorrow. It's going to be interesting to see. There was a good swath of half an inch of rain in an hour's time today. So some people really got some, including me at my house. We got some nice rain. So looking forward to a little bit more sun tomorrow, but we're going to stay unsettled. We're going to stay unsettled over the next several days. So, we can use the rain. We can use the rain, and hopefully we can keep the severe weather at bay.
It's hard to believe that it still bumfuzzles me that you guys are in a drought with this crazy active as the weather's been. Ricky, you and I spent the weekend together up here, and we were biting our fingernails and everything else watching this line of storms move through the Bristol area for the NASCAR race over the weekend.
Yeah, luckily the race got over before we had a storm pop up with a ping pong ball sized hail in Midway, Tennessee, which is in Greene County, about an hour or so southwest of the racetrack. So glad everything worked out for that. And we just had a good race here in Bristol on Sunday. And now we're dealing with nice 70-degree temperatures.
I will say, Ricky and I, we do weather support for the Speedway Motorsports Incorporated, and Bristol is Ricky's track. He works up there and knows everybody. And I normally get to tag along with Ricky on flood reports. That seems like for the past 3 or 4 events, we've been out at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning shooting live video for WCYB covering floods, and we didn't get to do that this year, Ricky. I'm kind of disappointed a little bit.
You're disappointed, but I'm glad I got a couple extra hours of sleep.
That's right. Yeah, that is true. That is true. So as we wrap up here, we do, Jared was talking about the unsettled weather pattern. We are going to be watching the weather this weekend, starting on Friday through Sunday. There's a chance of seeing some scattered showers and thunderstorms. We could see some stronger storms on Friday and then again on Sunday. So that's something we'll watch over the weekend. And if anything breaks out, we will definitely be here to cover it for you all. And next week, we'll be joined by Nate Johnson, former meteorologist at WRAL, and now he's a meteorologist lead for NBC, for the mothership NBC, and Jamie Morrow, who works for the National Weather Service in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're going to be recapping the April 16, 2011 tornado event that went through North Carolina, this biggest tornado event ever recorded in North Carolina, and we're going to be recapping that. And in fact, Ricky was out in the field chasing that day, so Ricky also will have some expertise and some comment from being out in the field watching these storms. So that will be our show next week, and then we're going to take a week off and enjoy spring break. So that's what is coming up for the Carolina Weather Group. So we appreciate you joining us tonight. Be sure to follow Rob on Twitter, and we appreciate you listening to us. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. If there's guests or topics that you would like for us to discuss, all you got to do is send them to us via Twitter or Facebook, and we will work on that. And if you ever just want to talk about weather, we're here too. We'll answer your weather questions. So we hope you have a great weekend. Stay weather aware over the weekend if severe weather threatens, and we'll see you back here next Wednesday night for another episode of the Carolina Weather Group.